Imagine the galaxy's most feared hunter on, apex predator whose name strikes terror in starfaring realms, kneeling before a single human. What could drive such an act? In the distant reaches of the Lydran expanse, an uncharted stretch of the cosmos whispered about in old spacer tales and forbidden fleet logs. Far beyond the mapped trade routes and satellite grids, there lies a moon, a place forgotten by time, a place called Obsidia. To the naked eye, it's a lifeless, coal-black husk suspended in a dead orbit around a dying gas giant. Obsidia has no cities, no colonies, no traffic beacons or orbital tags, just silence. Unnatural, suffocating silence. It's the kind of place navigators glance over quickly on long-haul charts. A graveyard of old satellites and broken whispers. But for those who know better, for those who've heard what the cartographers won't publish, Obsidia is a warning. Its surface is scarred with deep, ancient chasms like claw marks across the planet's skin. Its skies pulse with chaotic magnetic storms that ripple and distort even the most sophisticated sensors. Drones sent to map it go dark within minutes. Rescue ships never return. Some say it's cursed. Others say it's guarded. Either way, no one goes there willingly. But sometimes, fate doesn't ask for permission. Commander Riven Kael had never believed in curses. She believed in fuel ratios, trajectory lines, profit margins, and tight schedules. A former fleet tactician turned freelance salvager, Riven wasn't in the business of superstition. She was in the business of survival. Barely. Her last run for terrestrial freight had gone sideways when pirates vaporized the cargo en route. With debt collectors nipping at her heels and the fuel tank blinking red, Obsidia was her only remaining shot. A flagged wreck had gone down in the sector weeks ago. Valuable tech still on board, rumored to be untouched. High risk, higher reward. She had just breached Obsidia's upper atmosphere. When it all went wrong, the turbulence slammed into her ship like an invisible fist. Lightning cracked across the sky violet, and white-tan fire licked along the shuttle's nose cone. Warning lights screamed to life, painting the cockpit in pulses of red and amber. Autopilot disengaged. Artificial gravity failed. And somewhere, in the chaos, a proximity alert blared just once before cutting to static. Norex Corporation's orbital sentries had spotted her, and Norex didn't ask questions, they just fired. Plasma bolts sliced through the storm clouds, cutting arcs across her hull. The first hit took out her nav system. The second shredded a stabilizer fin. The third she didn't remember, only that she was spiraling, upside down. Flames kissing the stars through her viewport, the moon's black surface rushing up to greet her. The ground hit like a freight train. Steel shrieked against rock. Bulkheads caved inward. Fire tore through the aft section. The cockpit cracked open like an egg against the obsidian cliffside, throwing her forward. Bone snapped her forearm. She knew immediately. Her vision blurred. Alarms fizzled out. And then, quiet. Real quiet. The kind that doesn't hum with ship systems or wind or bird song. The kind that makes your ears ache because there's absolutely nothing to hear. Smoke curled from the twisted frame of her shuttle, rising into the magnetized sky. Like ghostly fingers, Riven coughed, each breath a stab of pain. Her eyes fluttered open. Every inch of her screamed to stay still, but instinct won out. She moved. Her left hand still worked. She grabbed the emergency plasma torch, barely a weapon, more of a tool. But right now, it was the only thing between her and whatever came next. She staggered to her feet. The air outside was thin, and cold and metallic. Obsidia didn't just feel dead, it felt hostile. Like the planet itself didn't want her there. That's when she heard it. The growl. Low, deep, not the wind, not the wreckage, groaning. Something else, something alive. It vibrated in her chest, not her ears of predators. Growl, ancient territorial. She turned. At first she thought it was a shadow cast by the wreckage. Then it moved. Massive L hunched, nearly 3 meters tall. Its skin was like slate carved by blades, layered, cracked, armored. Eyes glowed like molten ore, fixed on her with an intensity that made her legs forget how to move. Her breath caught no words, no thoughts, only one name echoed in the back of her. Skull. Scourge. See single quotes. D heard the stories every spacer had. Creatures from the lost warworld of Carden, engineered centuries ago during the Civil Titan Wars, genetically perfected apex predators, immune to pain, bred for battle. So dangerous they destroyed their own creators. The few that survived had vanished into deep space, hunted to extinction, or so people believed. And yet here it was, watching her, not attacking, not charging. Watching. She raised the torch, shaky and weak. The light flickered. Her grip trembled. It stepped forward. The ground shook beneath it. She swung wide, more from fear than strategy. Sparks flared as the torch scraped rock. The creature dodged fluid, fast. And then, it paused, its head tilted. It stared into her, just at her, but into her. Measuring something, she didn't know what made her speak. Maybe desperation, maybe madness, but she did, in a language she'd only practiced once. On a dare. During a cargo run to the old mercenary markets on Loran Prime, she spoke the ancient Lydran tongue. "You don't belong here," she said. Her voice cracked, her heart thundered in her ears. The creature stood still. Then, slowly, Impossibly, it dropped to one knee. Not out of pain, not submission, recognition. Riven stood there, torch humming, frozen in time. Nothing in her training, her salvager's life, or even her nightmares could explain what she was seeing. And yet, in that moment, she was no longer alone on Obsidia. The myth had bowed, the predator had knelt, and something deep within the moon had awakened. Riven didn't move. She didn't dare. The plasma torch hissed quietly in her grip, its glow flickering against the chaos of the wind that screamed through the ravine. Sparks fluttered off the blade, like dying fireflies vanishing into the night. Her breath caught in her throat, heart hammering so violently she could feel it in her fingertips. The creature before her, this towering, monstrous thing that should have torn her limb from limb, was kneeling, not collapsing, not defeated. It was deliberate. And then, he lowered his gaze, not to the ground, to her. Not submission, recognition. That realization sent a strange ripple through her, a chill not of fear, but of something deeper, something old, unnamed. Her legs moved before her brain caught up, taking one cautious step backward, then another. The torch stayed up, the only barrier between her and the impossible. Her mind raced. Was this some kind of manipulation? A predator's trap? Playing with her, like a beast toying with prey before the kill? She'd seen creatures do that before, on fringe planets, on war-torn moons, but this wasn't that. No snarl, no tension in his limbs, just silence. Then, without a word, he stood, massive shoulders rising, the obsidian light outlining the sinew and jagged armor plating of his body. He turned, not quickly, not threateningly, just turned, and with slow, heavy steps, he walked away. Into the storm, the thick, violet mist of Obsidia seemed to close behind him like a curtain, swallowing his shape whole. She was alone again. The quiet returned, now more hollow than before. Her legs almost gave out. She leaned against a rock, the adrenaline crashing like a wave. She breathed, once, twice. Her lungs burned, like the air wasn't enough anymore. She should have run, should have crawled back to the wreckage, sealed the hatch, tried to repair the comms, begged for evac. She should have, but she didn't. Because something she couldn't name pulled her forward. Not just curiosity, not just fear. It was something stranger, like fate had laid a thread between them, and she had stepped into it without knowing. For the next 2 days, they became dancers in a quiet ritual neither of them had choreographed. He would appear, not up, close, not threatening. Sometimes, she'd spot him standing at the edge of the canyon, just watching, silhouetted by the jagged skyline, a statue carved from night. Other times, he left things. Strange things. A shard of glimmering metal, shaped like no alloy she'd seen. Bioluminescent mosses that glowed blue-green under the moonlight she recognized. Their medicinal value from old fleet med guides. When she pressed one against the cracked flesh on her arm, it hissed and stung like acid. She nearly threw it away. But then, it healed rapidly. Wounds knitting, like time was folding. She looked for him after that, but he was already gone. On the 4th night, her fuel cell finally died. The backup cell drained. The solar reserves, Obsidia's storms, made sure those were worthless. She sat by the wreckage in the pitch dark, breathing into her gloves, watching the cockpit lights fade out one by one, and then she heard stone crack. Heavy footsteps. Close this time. She turned, and he was there, in his clawed hands. He held something, a geode as tall as her torso. Without hesitation, he hurled it against the canyon wall. It exploded with a deafening crack, splitting open in a burst of light. Inside, crystal, not just any crystal, Lathori, a perfect conductor. She stared, stunned, unable to believe her own eyes. She gathered it, piece by piece, with shaking hands. By the time she looked up to thank him, he was gone. Again, that night, she didn't try to sleep. She sat on the cold metal of her ruined shuttle, staring at the darkness, watching the storm roll over the distant cliffs. The wind howled. The stars blinked in and out of visibility like faulty signals. She looked toward the edge of the ridge, and softly said, "Why are you helping me?" No answer came, but the wind shifted. Moments later, she saw him step into view, not near, but not far. Standing still, then he knelt, and with the edge of a broken crystal shard, he scratched shapes into the dirt at his feet. A sun, a child, a flame, and a broken sword. She watched, trying to make sense of the sequence. Her mind spun through languages, metaphors, war records. She didn't understand, but she looked at him. Rayleigh looked, and she saw something in his eyes. Not rage, not hunger, but history, sorrow. He was exiled. She felt it like a whisper in her bones. Banished, bound, failed, whatever. His people had demanded of him. He had not fulfilled it. And so here he was, on this cursed moon, a prisoner without chains. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she walked forward, and without fear, without torch, without hesitation, she sat down beside him in the shadow of the storm. No questions, no answers, just silence. "We're both wrecks." Then, she said at last, her voice quiet. He didn't move, but he didn't leave either. And in that moment, on a forgotten moon beneath a sky of endless thunder, 2 exiles shared something more powerful than words. Understanding. And from that understanding, something new began to take root. The storm cleared. Not all at once, just enough for the sky to part like a wounded veil, revealing slashes of faint starlight through the thick, copper-colored clouds. For the first time in days, the electric hum that clung to Obsidia's atmosphere began to fade. The dust settled. The wind fell to a low, uneasy whisper, and with that fragile calm came trouble. Riven felt it before she heard it. That tight twist in the gut, that sixth sense only battle-hardened soldiers and fugitives ever truly trusted. Trouble always comes when the world goes quiet. The crackle of static on a long-range signal, then the sound of something sharp and mechanical scraping against stone. Crunch. Boots. Metal. Boots. Multiple pairs. She was already moving low to the ground. Behind the jagged ribs of her shattered hullahs, the unmistakable worry of Norax-class ground drones echoed through the gorge. Then she saw them. 4 figures in matte black armor, each one bearing the Norax insignia burned into their shoulder plates. Their visors glowed red. Their rifles glowed hotter. Real weapons, military grade, designed not for warning shots but for VAP, ORIZING. No protocol, no negotiation, just retrieval and termination. Riven's hand flew to her plasma torch, but it was too late. She was exposed. One of them turned, aiming. Barrel of his rifle snapped into line with her heart. She froze. No time to duck. No time to run. The trigger clicked, but the bolt never came. Not to her, because in the blink of an eye, before the energy charge could even leave the chamber, something collided with the soldier from above. A blur of motion, a roar that shattered the stillness. Dr. Azg. He dropped from the canyon wall like a falling comet, his massive body crashing into the soldier with a force that sent both hurtling into the rock face. Metal screamed, bones cracked. Dust exploded outward in a shockwave. The soldier's body went limp before he even hit the ground. The others turned, shouting commands into their coms. Too late, Drazgor was already moving again, an avalanche of muscle and fury. The second soldier got a shot off, the bolt catching Drazgor clean in the side. It burned, seared, crackled through armor and skin. But it didn't stop him. If anything, it enraged him. He slammed into the shooter with a guttural roar, tearing through the man's exosuit like it was nothing more than wet fabric. Wires snapped. Sparks flew. The screams didn't last long. The third drone hesitated, just for a second. Big mistake. Drazgor caught him by the helmet, lifted him clear off the ground and drove him into the stone with such force that the ground beneath them cracked like glass. Riven stood frozen, watching the impossible unfold. Horror clawed at her throat, but so did AHO. This was no myth, no old war story. This was power. Raw, elemental, unstoppable. But even gods bleed. The last drone, a sharper one, flanked Drazgor from behind. His aim was clean, his rifle locked in, but the shot wasn't meant for Dr. Azg. It was aimed at her rib. Saw the glow. Time slowed. She reacted on instinct, hurling the plasma torch at the soldier with all her strength. It spun through the air like a dying star, missing him by a full meter, and clattering harmlessly to the rocks. The soldier didn't even flinch. Hideous finger tightened on the trigger. She braced herself for the end, but she never felt the burn because Drazgor was there. Again. Between her and the blast. The bolt struck him in the chest dead center. A searing flash of light, a sound like air being torn apart. Smoke rose from the wound. He dropped to one knee, his great shoulders sagging. A hand pressed against his chest. His breathing was shallow, raspy. He didn't roar this time, didn't move to retaliate. He just looked at her like he needed to make sure she was still alive, and then he collapsed. Riven didn't think. She ran to him, sliding on her knees across the dirt and shattered glass of war, her hands fumbling at the pouch strapped to his side. Her fingers found the alien biotech gel he'd once used to save her. She didn't care that it burned. Didn't care that her hands were shaken, bloodied, useless. She slapped the patch against the smoking wound and pressed hard. The gel hissed and bubbled, steam rising between her palms. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of everything. "Don't you dare die." She didn't care that tears streaked down her face, that her voice was breaking, that her whole body was trembling. She looked into his eyes, those glowing, alien eyes that had once stared at her with quiet calculation and now blinked sluggishly. "With pain? Not after all this," she whispered. "Not after the healing, not after the geode, not after the stars and the symbols and the sitting in silence when they didn't have words. Not after he chose to stand between her and death. Not after becoming something more." She stayed there, her body pressed against his massive chest, whispering useless words and praying to gods she didn't believe in. And in the shadows behind her, another storm began to rise, but this time, she wasn't running. Not anymore. The remaining drones didn't stay. Whatever protocol they followed, whatever kill commands or asset retrieval sequences they had been programmed to execute, none of it mattered now. They had seen something they couldn't explain, something they couldn't fight, and worse, something they couldn't control. 3 of their number lay broken, twisted, unrecognizable, scattered like debris across the obsidian canyon floor. Their strongest shots had been absorbed. Their armor meant nothing. Their tactics useless. This wasn't part of the mission briefing, so they turned. No words, no retreat order. just a silent, synchronized step backward. Then another dot, and then they vanished into the smoke. They came from ghosts fleeing a nightmare of their own making. The wind returned, whispering through the cracked stone and shattered gear, swirling dust around the jagged silhouette of Riven Kael. Kneeling beside the being who had shielded her with his own body, Drazgor was still, barely breathing. Steam hissed gently from the alien. Biotech gel spread across his chest, the burn still fresh. The scent of ozone and scorched flesh thick in the air. Riven's hands trembled against the thick armor plating of his ribs. Sticky with blood, his blood. Her knees dug into the sharp gravel, but she didn't feel the pain. She only saw him. Her voice had gone silent. She couldn't speak, didn't need to, because he was looking at her. Those eyes, like molten or cooled into embers, were dimmer now, but not dead. They still burned, even through the haze of pain. And then, slowly, he moved. His great clawed hand, weathered by battles, scarred by 100 wars across systems long forgotten, lifted from the ground with effort, trembling but deliberate, held her breath. He pressed the tip of one claw to her chest, right above her heart. Just enough pressure to feel it, just enough to know. And then, he knelt, but not like before. This time, it wasn't in confusion, not in recognition, not in surrender. This time it was a vow, a bond made in silence, in fire, in war. Riven stared, barely breathing, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. The wind rushed past her face like it too was holding its breath. This wasn't just a gesture, it was ancient, ceremonial, a creature bred for conquest, trained to dominate, born into a world that worshipped strength above all else he had chosen. This her, a salvager, an outcast, a human, and not even a celebrated one, not a hero, not a commander in shining armor, just someone who'd survived long enough to crash where no one else dared go. Someone who listened, someone who tried. And yet, he knelt not to beg, but to offer a vow without words. To protect, to serve, to trust. It struck her like a bolt of lightning through the ribs. This wasn't about power anymore. It never had been. The galaxy had always measured strength by how loud a weapon could fire, how tall a wall could stand, how many lives could be crushed beneath the heel of empires. That was the currency of power in starfaring civilizations. But maybe it was wrong. Maybe strength wasn't domination. Maybe it was sacrifice. Maybe it was choosing mercy when you could have chosen murder, choosing connection over conquest, understanding over instinct. Here, kneeling before her, was a being who could have ripped her apart without effort. But instead, he gave her something no empire could forge: loyalty, not born in blood, but in trust. And for the first time in her life, Riven Kael felt something in her chest shift, like some ancient compass had realigned. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't stranded. She wasn't salvage. She was chosen by a creature the galaxy had forgotten. And as the moon of Obsidia pulsed with stormlight once more, a new force was born, not out of strategy, not out of programming, but out of something far rarer. Bond between the predator and the prey, who no longer feared him. Between the exile and the wreckage that somehow healed him. Between two souls who had every reason to give up, and chose instead to stand together. Dr. AZG or Rose. Not quickly, not effortlessly, but with purpose, with pain, with power. Every movement of his body was a testament to survival. Each fiber of muscle groaning beneath scorched armor, each breath rising like thunderclouds over the cliffs of Obsidia. His chest, torn and seared just moments ago, now rose with the breath of the living, barely, but surely. The blood still dried against his side. The gel still hissed in its silent work, but he stood. He stood, and beside him, smaller, wounded Riven Kael. Her boots were cracked, her uniform torn, a slash of dried blood running down one cheek. Her hands still trembled from the battle, but she did not hide them. She didn't pretend she wasn't afraid, because fear was no longer weakness. It was proof that she'd faced the impossible, and stayed there. They stood, warrior and hunter and hunted, neither what they used to be. Something had changed. Between the crash and the silence. Between the watching and the kneeling. Between the pain and the healing. They were different in every possible way, genetically, culturally, cosmically. Their worlds were galaxies apart, but they had bled on the same soil, breathed the same scorched air, faced the same enemy. And most of all, they had chosen not to abandon one another. Together, they had survived not by command, not by treaty, not because someone ordered it, but because they chose to. And in a galaxy that measured everything by dominance, by how many ships you could deploy, how many systems you could enslave, how many voices you could silence, this was something no one expected. They hadn't forged an empire, they hadn't claimed a throne, they hadn't even spoken the same language for most of it, but they had forged something far rarer. A pact. A bond, not born in conquest or superiority, but in empathy. In quiet moments, in shared wounds, in trust earned not with promises, but with action. The sky above them cracked open again. The next storm rolled across Obsidia with fury and fire, twisting winds and molten rain that turned stone to glass and silence to chaos. Lightning like claw marks ripped across the clouds. Thunder rolled like the footsteps of gods returning from war. But this time, the storm didn't find them broken. It didn't find them hiding. It didn't find them scattered across the rocks like prey. No, it found them standing side by side. Dr. AZG, or once the apex predator of a long-dead war world. Banished and broken, now reborn as something more than a weapon. And Riven Kael, once a forgotten salvager, hiding from the sins of the past. Now burning with a purpose she never thought she deserved. They were no longer what they had been. He was no longer alone. She was no longer just a survivor. Together, they were something new. Predator and human. Guardian. An outcast. Warrior and witness. Not conquerors, but protectors. And as the storm howled its fury around them, as the magnetic winds rose, and the first drops of searing rain hissed against the stone, neither of them flinched. Because the war outside no longer mattered more than the bond they'd built within, and somewhere far beyond that storm, far beyond Obsidia and its cursed moons. Change began to ripple across the stars. In hushed corners of command rooms, in whispers between diplomats. In rogue transmissions on forgotten frequencies. A story was beginning to spread. Of a predator who bowed. Of a human who rose. Of a bond that rewrote what strength meant, and the galaxy. It began to shift, just slightly, but enough to remember that even in the darkest corners, hope survives when it stands side by side.